Brett Warburton Smith is a partner at insurers Lockton, and he advises clients on the risks of cyber attacks, as well as being a key part of the professional services team. Perhaps we can start just by talking about cyber policy cover. Can you tell me how this might impact on professionals, and what are the sort of premiums that people have to pay to be covered for this?
Just expanding on exploring what it covers, and whether any professional service firm, whether you're an architect, an engineer, or a contractor, should consider specialist cover. There's two elements to an insurance policy, a specialist cyber insurance policy: what we call the first party element and the third party element. So the first party is where you can imagine, as a large, any sort of organization, you are conducting your business. Mostly it's done via emails nowadays, or on Teams calls, etc., etc. You are holding and hosting quite a lot of potentially private and sensitive information as an organization, whether that be your employee information or your client information. So God forbid, if the organization is attacked, whether that be a targeted attack or an untargeted attack, or indeed someone within the IT department that wants to be malicious. And that's happened quite a lot, unfortunately, within certain sectors, particularly in the retail sector. It's a very well-known case, Morrison's, the supermarket chain. The temporary FD decided to download all of the associate or the employee data and then sell it to his buddy down the pub. So the policy responds to, if an incident occurs, it will bring in specialist security firms to allow and help you deal with that incident. Now that can be resolving the incident, because it could be ongoing. It could be how to communicate with your staff, how to communicate with your clients and tell them that you've suffered a breach, how to notify the incident to the ICO, the Information Commissioner. What are your regulatory obligations as part of that? So the policy triggers and brings in all these specialists. So they're typically, as I say, security experts, accountants, forensic experts, lawyers, PR experts, to come in and support you, the organization, handling and dealing with that breach. And we know that if in any sort of incident, if the whole of the network's taken down, or indeed some of the small part of the network's taken down, it can be very challenging trying to resolve and deal with the fallout from that, not least before your clients start complaining at you, saying, hang on a second, I thought you were going to send me that report by 4 o'clock this afternoon, you haven't done that. It gets tricky quite quickly. So that's the first party element of the policy is absolutely the breach, what we call the breach response services. The third party aspect of the policy is when your clients as an organization start to sue you because of your failure to look after their private and sensitive information. So they'll bring a claim against the organization, alleging that you were you failed to look after their information. They have subsequently financially suffered, therefore they're going to bring a claim, and they expect to be paid damages, compensation, etc. As a result of your inability to look after that information. And that would be a liability claim, a traditional liability claim brought against the organisation, and the policy should pay that, assuming it is as a consequence of a security event, so a hack that has compromised that information that's gone missing. Now, what typically happens is actually a ransomware type cover, ransomware type incident happens. So the attack is deployed by the criminals, and they take down part of the network, and you can't do what you're meant to be doing, transacting business, supplying projects, delivering on the professional services you promised to your clients, etc., etc. So the ransom and the attackers demand a ransom, and they expect the ransom to be paid. And if you don't pay it within a certain period of time, the ransom may go up, or they threaten to publish the information that they have stolen from your network. And often what happens is actually the ransom is paid. Unfortunately, the ransom is paid by the insurance company. It is usually the last resort, and it's usually because the consequences of not paying it are more expensive than paying it. So they conclude quite quickly, usually, look, we're not going to be able to get this network back to where it was prior to the breach. Therefore, let's just pay the ransom and get the electronic key back, and off we go again. The tricky issue is if you're dealing with a particularly malicious attacker, that quite often they won't give you the key back. So you won't be able to get access back to your network. So what the security experts do is they have now determined who are the kosher hackers and who are the slightly edgier hackers.
Oh,
the kosher hackers will probably get their ransom demand paid quite quickly. Those that are not quite so professional in a criminal way probably won't get the ransom paid. So we're finding that attackers are targeting those the sophisticated criminals are targeting organizations, sometimes with cyber insurance, actually, because they've determined that they've got cyber insurance and they know the ransom is going to be paid. So that's a long way of saying there's a lot of coverage within a specialist policy, and very happy as part of this potentially to share more technical information around the coverage. How is it priced and how much does it cost? The pricing, you might be surprised, has changed. You may not be surprised, actually. It's changed significantly in the last 2 or 3 years. It's got a lot more expensive than it ever was. It's initially based off size of organization. So depending on how big you are in terms of revenue, depending on what you do, where you do it, how you do it, and how secure you are, is dependent on how expensive it is. But the cost 2 or 3 years ago was nominal. It's now quite substantial for a few £1 million worth of cover. We're talking a minimum of probably £15,000 per £1 million worth of cover, up to a lot more than that, depending on how secure you are. And the underwriters, the insurers, spend a reasonable amount of time understanding your security. Are you better than the organization next door? How are you securing your network? How are you educating your staff not to click on the link that's coming in with the malware? How are you assessing behavior? What sort of endpoint protection do you have? Do you deploy multi-factor authentication, etc., on access to the network, so on and so forth? So it's a lot more analytical and technical, the review now, than it was 2 or 3 years ago by insurers. And unfortunately, a lot of professional services firms have struggled to get cover because their security is not being good enough. I'm not saying that that's not a general comment, but there are several, we come across them every day, where organizers are just not ready to go out into the market and secure specialist cover. But that actually has driven different behavior. It's meant engineers, architects have gone back to the starting point and said, okay, we need to sit down and work out why we're not secure, which is usually quite easily done, and then get prepared to go in and buy specialist cover by improving our security.
So what sort of things do they need to do to prove to you that they are secure?
They need to have the basics in place, which are pretty fundamental nowadays and mostly common sense. So working from home, accessing your network from your laptop or from your work laptop or your personal laptop, how is that done? Do you have a form of multi-factor authentication in place? So what that means is, when you go on, you probably can't see it, do you use a 6-figure digit to get into your laptop to access the network? What access are you allowing third parties onto the network? Are they using multi-factor authentication to get in as well? Because often they're not. What about admin passwords? So people with a higher level of access to the network to get into the crown jewels into the network. Not everyone should have access to that. And is it limited, that admin access to the crown jewels within an organization? Are you monitoring the endpoint? So where you're accessing, where your network is linking onto the World Wide Web, onto the internet, is that being monitored? Are you updating your software? So, for example, the Apple Safari download that we all had to do for our iPhones and our laptops and so on and so forth, that was simply because they have well, in fact, I understand a third party determined that there was a significant vulnerability in their software, which was capable of being exploited. So they could have, the hackers could have broken in that way and exfiltrated data, sensitive information, whatever it may have been. So there was a vulnerability in the software. And when you download the new Safari or the app version 15.6 or wherever we are now, that is improving security. That's fixing that vulnerability within the software that Apple had. And we've seen that every piece of software out there that we use every day, whether that be Microsoft, Apple, whatever, has vulnerabilities. And many of those are exploited within months of the software being published. And then there's a fix that's discovered, and then they deploy the patch, and off we go. We download the patch, and the vulnerability is then resolved. And it can't be exploited. So yeah, it's always good that if you take anything away from this conversation, always download the new software patches that are presented to you through Microsoft or Apple or whatever as quickly as you can, because you are vulnerable if you don't.
Yeah, that's good advice. So, do people's professional indemnity policy protect them in any way from cyber events, and how does that interact with a cyber policy?
So yes, the simple answer is they can do a professional indemnity policy. All the firms listening to this will have some form of professional indemnity in place. Obviously, that protects them from claims coming against that business, against that firm, for failure in the delivery of their professional services, whether they've got the advice wrong, or they've created the model wrong, or whatever it may be, and a claim comes in. So you can see how, going to my first point around the first party and the third party aspect of a cyber policy, if a client suffers a loss as a consequence of a cyber attack, then there could be a third party claim brought against that organization by one of their clients. So and if it is a cyber event as a consequence of a hack, then it could fall either, and there are third parties damaged, it could fall to either the cyber policy or the professional indemnity policy. And it's really important to understand which should respond, and your broker should advise you on which is best to respond. One policy will probably have a far lower excess deductible than the other, so you might want to push the claim into the cyber policy as opposed to the PI policy, but it will depend on the circumstances at the time. But there is definitely an overlap. The easiest way of dealing with that potential overlap is for those third-party claims, those cyber claims that might fall to both policies, is to get written into your professional indemnity policy and your cyber policy, assuming you've got one, language that confirms which one will respond first. And then you can, that makes it black and white. It's a binary. Okay, this is very clear. The PI policy is going to respond to that first, and then the cyber policy, or vice versa. So it's really important to have that clarity within the policy wordings. Your
key bit of advice to everybody would be to have six-figure authentication every time you log into your systems, would it?
Multi-factor authentication is probably the biggest item that insurers, and probably the most sensible security task that you should have on your accessing your network, whether you're remoting in from work or from a train, or however you do it when you're in the office. There may be another level of security within the office. You've obviously used your passcode to get in the office. You're probably using a laptop that's issued to you by the office, which has got a BitLocker code on or something like that. So various forms of authentication that you are who you are before you get on access to the network is absolutely the key takeaway. Yeah. Without that, you're never going to get any insurance in place.
Great. Well, that's very good advice. So thank you very much, Brett, for your thoughts on this. I guess it's the sort of thing that people think never's going to happen to them, and until it does. So good to be forewarned. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thank you, Peter.